Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever wondered what happens when, a massive project like a mine sets up shop right next door to a small community? It sounds like a straightforward question, but the answers, as we've discovered diving into sources like Dr. Karl-Heinz Spitz and John Trudinger's Mining in the Environment, are anything but simple.
Yeah.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into community development, specifically in the mining sector, but honestly, uncovering lessons that apply far beyond just digging for minerals.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these seemingly disconnected worlds of, say, community well-being and heavy industry
Right.
are actually deeply intertwined.
Right.
Our mission today is really to extract those vital nuggets of knowledge from this material, giving you a shortcut to understanding what genuine, successful community development looks like.
And crucially, why it's so much more than just a PR exercise or some token goodwill gesture.
Exactly. It's not just about looking good.
So, if you've ever felt maybe overwhelmed by how large-scale developments impact local lives, or perhaps question what it really takes to create lasting, positive change, then you're definitely in the right place. We're going to explore how companies can shift from being, mere benefactors to becoming genuine partners, forging benefits that can actually outlive the mine itself. And here's where it gets really insightful.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So when I first thought about community development in mining, I have to admit, my mind immediately went to things like, a company sponsoring the local festival, or maybe building a swimming pool for its employees.
It's a common starting point, isn't it? The visible, tangible stuff.
Exactly. It feels like a common initial misconception.
Yeah.
But our sources, particularly Frank and Smith back in 1999, they push us towards a much deeper, more powerful definition.
They do.
They describe community development as the planned evolution of all aspects of community well-being, economic, social, environmental, and cultural. And that, for me, that feels like the real game changer. Why is it so crucial to broaden our view like that to all aspects?
It's crucial because it forces a truly holistic perspective. Instead of just these isolated projects like a new school building here or a donation there,
Right.
this definition demands that companies consider the entire ecosystem of a community's life. How do economic decisions impact local culture? How does environmental health affect social stability?
It's all connected.
It's all connected. It's about building a self-sustaining system, fundamentally, not just handing out temporary benefits. And for this broader, more effective model, our sources really emphasize two non-negotiable elements: genuine consultation and deep collaboration.
Non-negotiable. I like that.
Absolutely. Because communities are dynamic, they're always changing, so any successful model has to be flexible. It has to be ready to adapt. This isn't a sort of one-and-done deal.
Makes sense.
And our sources outline a kind of four-step process for this. First, you build support. Second, develop a solid plan. Third, you work to maintain that momentum.
Keep it going.
Keep it going. And finally, you implement, and you continuously adjust that plan. And woven through all of this is the concept of community capacity.
Okay, capacity. What does that really mean here?
It's not just about having enough people or enough money. It really encompasses things like leadership, commitment, resources, planning skills, real experience in community affairs.
Got it.
But what's often overlooked, and this is something I found quite surprising in the research, is that community development often needs to begin with building capacity within the mining company itself.
Oh, that's interesting. We usually think of the community needing the capacity building. Why inside the company first?
It is a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? But think about it. If the mining company itself lacks the internal expertise or the long-term vision, or frankly, the cultural sensitivity to genuinely engage, even the best intentions are just going to fall flat. It's like having all the tools to build a house, but not actually knowing how to use them properly yourself.
You need the internal know-how.
Exactly. And interestingly, the sources suggest that responsible national or government-owned mining companies often do better here.
Why is that?
Because their local staff usually have that deep, embedded knowledge of the community and often a stronger, longer-term commitment to its success. Whereas for some public company personnel, unfortunately, it can sometimes feel just another project.
The transient nature, perhaps?
Precisely. And that mindset is a huge hurdle for genuine CD.
That distinction really highlights what we mean when we say community. It's clearly not just about a line on a map of geographic boundary, which is often our first thought, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
A community can also be a group bound by common interest or origin, like maybe a specific religious group or an ethnic group, or even something like a long-standing fishing community you mentioned.
Multiple identities.
Right. The material makes it really clear that people often belong to multiple communities at the same time. So what's the core takeaway from understanding this diversity?
The core implication is simply that you cannot assume homogeneity. You just can't. Each of these communities has its own unique attributes, its own histories, its own expectations.
Right.
So any simplified idea that they'll all react in the same way to a big development project is, as our sources put it very clearly, ill-founded.
Makes sense. You ignore that complexity at your peril.
You really do. You have to recognize and genuinely understand those diverse interests and unique traits. And this is especially critical when we think about indigenous peoples, or IPs.
Yes, IPs are often central in these discussions.
Very much. They're the original inhabitants, the traditional owners of what's often called ancestral land. And while there are various ways to identify indigenous communities, the World Bank has offered some useful criteria. Things like their deep attachment to ancestral territories, their distinct cultural identity, often a distinct language, customary social institutions, maybe a more subsistence-oriented economy, and crucially, their vulnerability.
Vulnerability seems key there.
It is. Past experience, unfortunately, confirms that IPs, especially smaller communities, are often economically, socially, and politically disadvantaged by mine development. They're frequently seen as the custodians of the last remaining pristine territories, which makes engaging with them even more sensitive and, well, critical.
When a project starts, how does a company typically approach this interaction?
Our sources point to two kind of broad initial approaches: insulation versus integration.
Insulation, like building a wall.
Pretty much, yeah. Insulation is often the preferred mode during the initial construction phase. Think of it exactly like putting up a fence, restricting access to the site.
Why do that?
Primarily to minimize immediate impacts, prevent security issues, manage safety hazards, both for the workers and for the local people. The goal is basically to keep the often large and temporary construction workforce largely separate from the local community.
Okay, I can see the logic during that hectic construction period,
Yeah.
but I imagine that approach can't or shouldn't last forever.
You're absolutely right. Our sources make it clear that insulation becomes far less practical and actually often counterproductive once the mine moves into its operational phase.
So what then?
At that point, the goal really needs to shift fundamentally towards integration. The aim here is for the project-affected community to, and I'm quoting loosely here, continue to thrive as an articulate, self-reliant, and mature community.
Okay, thrive. That's the goal.
That's the goal. And this leads us straight into the core principles of how you actually succeed in achieving that integration. And it boils down to that old saying, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it.
Ah, yes. That phrase really captures it. And from what we've read, getting that how right, especially from the very beginning, is just absolutely crucial.
It really is. Planning community development well before construction even kicks off is pretty much non-negotiable, according to these experts.
Before the first shovel hits the ground.
Absolutely. The construction phase itself is described as a break point, a period of intense activity, often confusion, crisis management. Contractors are there. They understandably have little incentive for long-term CD.
They're focused on building.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the absolute worst time to start thinking about CD, during the mine's operation phase.
Why so late is bad?
Because by then, the community might have been, and the source uses this word, traumatized by the construction impacts. Social cohesion could have already started to break down. So that early, deliberate planning is just paramount.
Okay, so plan early. What's foundational to that plan?
Respecting human and community rights.
Yeah.
This isn't just a nice to have, it's a core principle. It's underlined by international standards like the IFC Performance Standard 2, the UN Universal Declaration.
The big ones.
The big ones. And critically, communities must substantially determine the content of the CD programs themselves.
They need to be in the driver's seat.
Pretty much.
Right.
Otherwise, companies risk defaulting to what are essentially paternalistic top-down approaches, or worse, just handout programs that don't build any real capacity or genuine ownership in the long run.
So it's definitely not about just dropping off a check and walking away.
Exactly. Which leads us to another critical insight from the sources: minimizing direct financial transfers.
Ah, the cash problem.
Yes. A CD program based purely on charity, on cash handouts, is rarely sustainable. That cash can easily morph into a feeling of entitlement. It can foster mistrust, even outright corruption within the community.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
Now, companies often have moral or even legal obligations for contributions, but ideally, these should be fixed, transparent amounts, not tied directly to, say, fluctuating commodity prices or revenues.
Predictability.
Predictability is key. And interestingly, companies might actually need to finance the communities or even the local government's participation in the planning process itself, especially in developing countries where local resources for that kind of engagement might be really limited.
So investing in the planning capacity, too.
Precisely. And think about it this way. Community development can't operate in a vacuum in its own little silo.
Right, it has to connect.
It needs to be fully integrated with basically every other aspect of the mining operation: community relations, environmental management, land acquisition, purchasing, safety, security, all of it.
Because inconsistency anywhere could undermine the CD goals.
Easily. Inconsistent policies in any of those areas can completely derail the best CD objectives. A smart practice, our sources suggest, is actually having separate budgets for community development and community relations.
Why separate them?
To ensure clarity and focus. Community relations might be more about communication, grievance handling, while CD is about the long-term development programs. But perhaps the most vital piece is actively seeking local input in the design and execution of programs.
Getting them involved from start to finish.
Absolutely. Without that deep community integration into identifying programs, selecting them, designing them, well, we're warned that most programs will have limited success or fail entirely.
Wow. That's a strong warning.
It is. This kind of participatory planning, it takes time. There's no doubt about it. But the investment is absolutely worth it for achieving that long-term success and sustainability.
Time well spent, it sounds. And flipping to the governance side of things, it's not about the mining company becoming the new local government, is it? That seems like a recipe for a disaster.
No, absolutely not. That would be a huge mistake. Local government authority should never be bypassed. Mining companies should be supporting governments in fulfilling their responsibilities, not taking them over.
So partnership, not replacement.
Exactly. This brings us to what our sources call the tripartite principle. You can picture it like a triangle. Community, company, and government all working together.
Okay.
In this model, ideally, the government takes the lead role for core services like education and health, with the company providing support, perhaps technical or financial, but not control.
And who gets the support primarily?
The sources emphasize focusing CD support primarily on the project-affected people, the PAP. Their needs, genuine needs identified through participation, not external pressure from maybe more vocal or politically connected groups, should always drive the support.
Needs-based, not noise-based.
Well put. And considering impacts not just on the community as a whole, but at the individual, family, and even organizational levels within the community.
That's quite granular.
It needs to be. Then there's maintaining the natural resource base. This is huge, given that most local economies in these areas are often resource-based. Think farming, fishing, forestry.
Traditional livelihoods.
Precisely. CD programs should actively work to sustain and even enhance these sectors for life after the mine. Because, let's face it, a return to those traditional economies is often the only viable long-term option once the mine eventually closes.
Planning for the end from the beginning, in a way.
You have to. And related to that is aiming for self-financing programs where possible. This is about leveraging the initial CD funds as seed money.
Like venture capital for the community.
Yeah. Seed money for economic activities that can stimulate higher-level sustainable growth independent of the mine's direct funding stream.
Is there a good example of this?
Yes, our sources highlight a really compelling one, case 18.1, called Cassava for Biofuel.
Okay, tell me about that.
Imagine a mine needs biofuel for its operations. Instead of just importing it, the CD program helps establish a local industry cultivating cassava specifically for biofuel production.
Creating local demand.
Exactly. The mine's demand kickstarts a whole new sustainable local industry. And the beauty is that industry, growing cassava, processing it, could potentially continue to thrive long after the mine itself is gone.
Now that is a true legacy. That's impressive.
Isn't it? It shows how these programs should ideally benefit both the community and the mining company. Companies aren't purely altruistic, let's be clear. Successful CD is integral to creating the stable socioeconomic environment they need for successful long-term operation.
A stable neighbor is a good neighbor, essentially.
You could say that. And all of this, absolutely all of it, leads back to perhaps the most critical element of all: genuine community ownership.
Ownership, what does that look like in practice?
It means truly sharing decision-making power and the responsibilities that accompany such power. It's not a free lunch. Counterpart contributions are vital here.
What kind of contributions?
It could be the company providing materials for a project, and the community provided the labor, or community groups managing funds.
Yeah.
This fosters real pride, real empowerment, because they've invested themselves.
Not just received something, they've built it.
Exactly, they've built it.
So this brings us neatly to the actual process, the CD process in action. Our sources lay out a kind of programmatic cycle. How does that start?
It starts with a really thorough analysis of the current conditions, the needs, and the objectives. Understanding the community, its history, its current attitudes, its hopes for the future is actually just as vital for the mining company as understanding the geology of the ore body.
Wow, as important as the ore body, that's a statement.
It is. And this isn't superficial. It includes detailed socioeconomic studies, sometimes even conflict analyses, to understand existing tensions or potential flashpoints.
Proactive conflict understanding.
Yes. And our sources highlight that achieving informed support from the community, built on transparency and trust, is probably the most powerful tool a company has for countering project opponents, who will inevitably emerge.
Informed support counters opposition. Makes sense.
It does. This deep analysis then feeds directly into participatory planning. This is the truly bottom-up approach we've been talking about.
So not just telling them the plan, but building it with them.
Exactly. Here, communities aren't just passively informed. They actively identify their own needs and collaboratively plan the actions to address them. This process is also crucial for managing what some sources call the cargo cult phenomenon.
Cargo cult? What's that?
It's where communities might develop unrealistic expectations, perhaps believing the mine's mere presence will magically deliver unlimited prosperity without effort.
Ah, okay. Managing expectations.
Precisely. By providing realistic, clear information right from the start, companies can manage these expectations effectively and build genuine trust instead of fostering disappointment later. Partnerships, in this context, they evolve. You explore the potential, you build trust, and then you continuously work to maintain and strengthen those relationships over time.
It's an ongoing relationship, not a transaction. And to make these partnerships and plans more concrete, our sources talk about some practical tools and structures, right?
Yes, absolutely. Things like written agreements, for instance, are incredibly important, especially in the early phases.
Why written?
They increase confidence. They build trust by clearly outlining who commits to what. It avoids misunderstandings down the line. Then there are specific participatory methods, like participatory rural appraisal, or PRA.
PRA.
Yeah, it's a set of techniques used to work with communities to collaboratively gather information and identify needs, rather than just extracting data from them.
More collaborative data gathering.
Exactly. And the concept of a community development board is also highlighted as really key.
What does that board do?
It typically comprises a mix of formal and informal community leaders, maybe religious representatives and company representatives. Its job is to help identify, facilitate, and coordinate the CD programs. These boards can even oversee things like compensation arrangements or grievance mechanisms, ensuring local voices are heard directly at that level.
Giving structure to the partnership.
That's a good way to put it. And from the work of that board, or similar structures, you develop community action plans, or CKA.
Okay, COPs. What are they?
Think of them as detailed work plans. They're jointly owned by the community and its partners, and they serve as practical templates for future planning activities. Again, community ownership is the most important aspect here, fostering that pride and empowerment through shared responsibility and tangible contributions from their side.
Shared ownership, shared responsibility.
Exactly. And finally, something quite practical but essential: establishing clear codes of conduct.
For who?
For all project personnel, the company's direct employees, contractors, consultants, everyone who interacts with the community.
Why is that so important?
Because they foster mutual respect. Developed in consultation with the communities themselves, these codes cover critical issues like conduct regarding alcohol or narcotics, rules about accessing community areas, and especially appropriate relationships with local people, including women. They really set the expected standard of behavior for everyone associated with the project.
Setting clear boundaries and expectations for everyone involved makes sense.
It's crucial for building trust. But even with the best plans, the best codes, conflicts are, well, natural in complex projects like these.
Yeah, you can't avoid all disagreement.
You really can't. And that's why having formal grievance mechanisms is absolutely crucial. It's actually required now by international standards like the IFC performance standards.
So a formal way to complain and get heard.
Exactly. A clear, accessible process to identify, track, and resolve complaints. Common grievances often relate to land disputes, income losses, cultural impacts, maybe impacts on natural resources like water.
The core impact areas.
And while there are various ways to resolve these disputes, consensus-based negotiation is generally the preferred approach, especially when maintaining good long-term stakeholder relations is paramount.
Trying to find common ground.
Yes. And it's vital to remember here that people's perceptions of fairness are often just as important, sometimes even more important, than the objective reality of the situation.
Perception is reality in these cases.
It often is. And lastly, in this cycle, community development programs aren't static, they're dynamic. They need continuous evaluation.
Checking if they're actually working.
Precisely. Using both objective measures, like, say, number of jobs created, and subjective measures, like community satisfaction levels. Even successful programs need to adapt as the community itself changes over time.
How do you measure that effectively?
The sources talk about using indicators of sustainability. And ideally, the communities themselves should be involved in defining, developing, and using these indicators.
So they measure their own progress.
Exactly. There's a great real-world example mentioned: community technical working groups in the Philippines. These groups enabled multi-stakeholder monitoring community, government, company, NGOs, all looking at the project's environmental and social performance together, including its CD initiatives.
Collaborative monitoring?
Yes. And this ensures that programs which, frankly, fail to deliver the expected outcomes can be modified or even discontinued, allowing those resources to be redirected more effectively.
Right. Don't keep throwing good money after bad, essentially. Adapt.
Adaptability is key.
That continuous feedback loop sounds absolutely vital for making sure these programs stay relevant and effective over the long haul. And speaking of the long haul, we really have to talk about preparing for mine closure.
Yes, the end game. Critically important.
It seems critical because, as you've said, CD programs must aim to prevent long-term dependence on the mining company.
Absolutely. If they create dependency, they've ultimately failed, no matter how good they look during the mine's life.
So how do they avoid that?
By consistently emphasizing training and capacity building over things like direct financial support or temporary jobs. Our sources highlight 4 crucial determinants of development that these programs should aim to strengthen throughout the mine's life.
Okay, what are they?
Income generation skills and opportunities, improvements in education and health, appropriate infrastructure support, and that overarching theme: building local capacity.
Good capacity.
It keeps coming back. And planning for closure, including thinking about the future land use for the rehabilitated mine areas, that has to start in the early years of the project, not just tack on at the very end when it's often too late. Otherwise, communities can become completely economically stranded when the mine inevitably closes.
Planning the exit strategy from the entrance.
That's a very good way to put it, indeed. So when we look at the broad scope of these community development programs, what are they actually doing? Fundamentally, they're trying to mitigate the negative impacts of the mine while also stimulating social investment to try and offset the depletion of the natural resource, the ore body itself.
Okay, so mitigating harm and investing in the future. What kinds of programs fall under that?
Our sources categorize them into several key areas. First, income generation. And this is explicitly more than just temporary employment at the mine.
Right, because those jobs disappear.
Exactly. So the focus is on things like sustainable vocational training, building entrepreneurial skills, maybe microcredit schemes. And the Grameen Bank is highlighted here as a major global success story in microcredit that offers lessons.
It's the Grameen model, yeah.
And also promoting local procurement, buying goods and services locally, like that cassava for biofuel example we talked about earlier. Yeah. That creates lasting economic activity.
Makes sense. What else?
Health and sanitation. Now, the key here is that companies shouldn't try to replace government services.
The tripartite principle again.
Exactly. But they can support existing facilities, maybe upgrade clinics, support health education programs, things like malaria prevention, which is huge in some areas, and provide essential emergency response capabilities, like PT Freeport Indonesia's efforts in emergency medicine.
Supporting, not supplanting.
Precisely. Then there's education and training. This spans everything from basic literacy and numeracy needed for construction jobs, right up for professional skills for mine operation roles. It includes things like scholarships, maybe upgrading local schools or training centers.
Building human capital.
Definitely. Infrastructure support is another big one, especially in remote areas. This could be providing roads, power lines, clean water systems, sometimes even housing schemes, things the community might not get otherwise for decades.
Basic necessities in some cases.
Often, yes. And then capacity building again. This is all about preparing communities and, crucially, local governments to cope with the immense changes a mine brings.
Both community and government capacity.
Yes. It includes training in things like management, marketing, skilled trades, even civilian security training in some contexts, and fundamentally fostering a decision-making culture within the community itself so they're equipped to manage their own affairs.
Empowering them to manage change.
That's the goal. And perhaps surprisingly to some, environmental programs can also be part of this. Mining can actually generate funds needed for environmental protection in the surrounding area, maybe funding park rangers or conservation initiatives.
Turning a potential negative into a positive.
In some cases, yes. And through careful planning, it can even help protect cultural heritage sites. The sources mention the Jabiru 3 example, where a uranium deposit was deliberately left unmined to avoid disturbing sacred sites nearby.
Wow. So a conscious decision not to mine based on cultural value.
Exactly. It shows a different kind of value assessment.
Now, despite all these potential positives and best practices, we have to be realistic. The sources also say local benefits don't always eventuate as hoped. This seems like a really significant, complex challenge.
It absolutely is. It's where the rubber meets the road, and sometimes it skids.
For instance, you mentioned taxes and strengthening local governments.
Yeah.
What's the issue there?
A major hurdle highlighted is that central governments often fail to effectively transfer the mining revenue they receive back down to the local communities that are most impacted by the operations.
So the money gets stuck at the national level.
Often, yes. Our sources cite specific examples from places like Peru and Indonesia, where laws were actually created to ensure this revenue transfer happened, but due to, say, design flaws in the laws or a lack of transparency, very little of that money actually reached the intended communities on the ground.
And that must cause huge frustration.
Huge frustration. It fundamentally undermines local development potential and all the company's CD efforts. People see the wealth being generated, but they don't see the benefit locally.
Yeah, that would breed resentment. What about employment generation? That's often touted as a key benefit.
It is, but it faces criticism too. Critics argue, often validly, that mining jobs are frequently temporary. They often require skills that locals don't initially have, meaning outsiders get the jobs.
Taking jobs locals could have done.
Or jobs requiring skills they haven't had the chance to acquire yet. And critics also argue that mining can actively harm traditional livelihoods, like agriculture, maybe through land acquisition or water impacts. They contend that these negative effects, like displaced farming communities, can be permanent, while the mining jobs are usually not.
So the trade-off isn't always positive long-term.
Not necessarily. Successful CD programs absolutely have to anticipate and work to ameliorate these kinds of issues, maybe through agricultural support programs running alongside the mine.
Okay. And what about the broader economic stimulation or social services?
While mines definitely do stimulate local economies through their demand for goods and services, critics argue it's often not enough to create truly self-sustaining, diversified local development that lasts beyond the mine.
It's a temporary boom.
It can be, yes. Similarly, those social services, sometimes provided directly by the mine, maybe a company clinic or school, often cease operations the moment the project ends, if they haven't been properly transitioned to sustainable community or government ownership beforehand.
Leaving a big gap.
Leaving a painful void, exactly. And that erodes trust massively. And this leads us nicely, or perhaps not so nicely, into summarizing the common problems and, importantly, their effective solutions. Many issues seem to arise from simply ignoring those pointers to success we discussed earlier.
Not doing the homework up front.
Exactly. For example, a really frequent pitfall is not truly understanding the community, making assumptions instead of genuinely listening and learning.
What's the fix?
Participatory needs assessment, where the company acts more as a facilitator, relying on local knowledge and expertise to define the priorities.
Let the community lead the assessment.
Fundamentally, yes. Another common problem is unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, excluding certain community groups, especially women, from consultation and decision-making.
How do you address that sensitively?
By actively identifying culturally appropriate and sensitive ways to ensure all relevant voices are heard and included in the process. It takes effort, but it's crucial for legitimacy.
Okay. What else goes wrong?
Failing to evaluate results. It sounds basic, but social indicators can feel harder to formulate and track than, say, tons of ore moved.
The soft stuff gets neglected.
Often. But continuous monitoring of CD outcomes, using those indicators we talked about, is absolutely crucial for knowing if you're actually achieving anything and for adapting the program.
Makes sense. Keep score.
Keep score, exactly. Role confusion and power struggles between the company, government, and community groups are also pretty natural when you introduce major change.
How to manage that?
Transparency, open dialogue, and mutual respect are key to minimizing the negative effects. And related to that, unresolved conflicts. If grievances are ignored or suppressed, they will escalate.
Don't sweep things under the rug.
Definitely not. Creating an atmosphere where disagreements can be openly expressed and addressed is vital, even if you have to accept that you can't satisfy absolutely everyone on every issue.
Okay. What about the money issue again?
Ah, yes. The temptation to just throw money at problems.
Trying to buy goodwill.
Essentially. But it rarely works long term. It treats the symptoms, not the underlying causes, and it often raises those unrealistic expectations we mentioned, which will inevitably be dashed later on, causing more resentment.
So avoid the quick fix.
Avoid the quick cash fix, yes. Another big one. Not properly managing mine contractors and consultants.
Why is that so critical?
Because communities don't usually differentiate. They see everyone working on a project site, whether direct employee or contractor, as representing the company.
So a contractor's bad behavior reflects on the mine.
Absolutely, 100%. So strict codes of conduct must apply to everyone, and company representatives should ideally be present in meetings contractors have with communities to ensure alignment and accountability.
Unified front.
Unified, respectful front. And finally, a couple more big ones. Making promises that simply cannot be kept, or over-designing CD programs beyond what's realistic or sustainable for the scale and lifespan of the mine.
Under-promise and over-deliver, maybe?
Or at least promise realistically and deliver consistently. That builds trust. Over-promising inevitably leads to distrust and failure when reality hits. And one last point about NGOs.
Yes, non-governmental organizations. What's the issue there?
While NGOs can play a really vital, positive role, the sources caution against overemphasizing their involvement to the point where maybe international NGOs who aren't directly affected stakeholders themselves start dominating the agenda.
Their agenda might not match the local communities.
Potentially, yes. So companies should engage with NGOs based on what specific value they genuinely add to the process, focusing on mutual respect and tangible benefit for the actual affected community, not just NGO priorities.
Okay, so engage strategically based on added value.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance in all these complex relationships.
So after this really deep dive, what does this all mean for you listening? We've seen that true community development in mining, it isn't just about charitable donations or building a few facilities here and there.
Not at all.
It's actually a really sophisticated long-term process. It has to be built on genuine partnership, a deep and constantly evolving understanding of local needs, and crucially, a real commitment to empowering communities so they can thrive independently, even long after the mine inevitably closes. It's really about building a sustainable future, isn't it? Not just a temporary boost.
That's perfectly put. This exploration has shown us, I think, quite clearly that the operational success of a mining project and the enduring well-being of its surrounding communities are just intrinsically linked. You can't really separate them successfully in the long run.
They're intertwined.
Deeply intertwined. It's about meticulously designing that whole program cycle we discussed, ensuring every single step, right from the initial analysis all the way through to planning for eventual mine closure, prioritizes building that local capacity and fostering true local ownership. The ultimate challenge, perhaps, isn't just to extract resources from the earth, but maybe it's to extract the very best from the human potential within these communities alongside it.
That's a powerful thought, extracting human potential. You know, the story of community development in mining, it really feels like a microcosm of much broader global development challenges, doesn't it?
It really does.
It highlights how powerful partnerships, genuine respect for diverse cultures, and a clear, unwavering long-term vision can potentially transform what could be conflict into shared, lasting success. So as you reflect on all this, maybe consider this. Where else in your own life or perhaps in your work could applying these core principles of true consultation, deep collaboration, and that relentless focus on building sustainable capacity, where could that lead to surprising and maybe deeply resonant benefits?